So, good evening, friends. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me say that it's a good break from thinking about the finer intricacies of the bond markets and the G20's action plan. So, I shall take this opportunity to speak about something a little bit different. Although, as you will see, it does have implications about how we think about the world. So let me thank all of you, and in particular Bharatiya Shikshan Mandal, for organizing this FB broadcast. As you all know, the topic of today is about a historical perspective of India's place in the global economy. And in that context, I will say that I will speak briefly about a long sweep of Indian history, and then give you some sense of how that long history and its understanding helps us cope with what we are going through right now. Now, India's place in the global economy, of course, is one very much related to trade and interactions with the contemporary civilizations, empires, and so on of that time. It's a story of geopolitics. It's a story, as you will see, of very sharp shifts of fortune. So let's go right back to the beginning. If you went back to the Harappan period, that's the Bronze Age, 5,000 years ago, India already had very strong links with the global economy of that time, which were particularly the Bronze Age civilizations of Mesopotamia, but also rising cultures in Central Asia and elsewhere as well. And the fulcrum of a lot of this was, of course, the cities, the port cities of Gujarat. Now, in order to understand this, you have to understand that the landscape you are dealing with is very different. Saurashtra was then an island. Sea levels actually were higher than what they are now. And both the Saraswati and the Indus used to flow into what is now the Run of Kutch. So what is now the Run of Kutch was the estuary of these two very large rivers, as a result of which Dholavira, which is today far inland and is like a marooned hillock in the middle of the salt flats of Run of Kutch, that was actually a port. And from that port, you could go southwards towards Lothal, across what is now land, or you could go westward out towards past Dwarka, out towards Oman, Bahrain, the UAE, and eventually out to Mesopotamia. And Sumerian records tell us about a people called the Meluha, who came from the east and who traded in peacocks and elephant ivory and so on, clearly products that were of Indian origin. And we also have lots of archaeological evidence of Harappan products all over the Persian Gulf. And there was a huge amount of trade going on. We clearly know what the Indians were exporting. Clearly there were beads, there were weights and measures of Harappan origin flowing outward from Dholavira and the ports of Gujarat. And they are found in excavation sites all over the Persian Gulf. The question is, what were we importing from that? And that is some matter of controversy, because nothing that is obviously of external origin has ever been found in any of the Harappan sites. This incidentally is also true of Central Asian goods, even though Indians were clearly exporting products to the Central Asia, and there were Harappan sites even in Central Asia, and there are clearly many Harappan products, particularly beads, but also seals and other things which are found in Central Asia as well. And nothing of Central Asian or Middle Eastern has been found clearly in Harappan sites. Now, this leads to a lot of speculation of what those imports may have been. Now, my own guess is that at least one of those products was copper ore in particular from Oman, because we know that in this period there were copper sites there. But more controversially, there is some evidence coming up that it may have been horses. the Harappans were very likely importing horses both from the Arabs and from Central Asia. And there are now increasing evidence that horses were quite common in the Bronze Age in India, not just in the Harappans, but even further east into the Gangetic Plains. Now, this world that I have just described fell apart all of a sudden around about 2000 BC. Now, we have records from many other parts of the world, but now increasingly from India as well, which suggests that there was a massive drought. Now, the Saraswati River, of which we have remains in terms of the Ghaggar, had already been in steep decline by this point. In fact, it had been in decline by the time when the great Harappan cities were being built up. But by this point, around about 2000 BC, it completely stops flowing. And there are major droughts all over the world. So you see the shock in Mesopotamia, and the Sumerian cities have to be abandoned. There's a collapse in Egypt, and also there is an abandonment of the cities in the big Harappan cities in India. Now people migrate from that. Some of them migrate onto the Gangetic Plains. Many of them migrate northwards to the foothills of the Himalayas. Those from Gujarat seem to have migrated towards the south, towards the Narmada, and perhaps even further south. Now that ended the first great period of interaction between India and the rest of the world. Now, the next great period that emerges happens in the Iron Age. But this interaction now, a lot of the focus of that pops up in the eastern seaboard of India, particularly in the area between Lake Chilika, which is in today's Odisha, and the westernmost outlet of the Ganga, which we now call the Hooghly. So this zone, which is a Bengal-Odisha zone, becomes a hub of a lot of maritime activity in the Iron Age. And you begin to see, by certainly the 6th, 7th century BC, a lot of sailors begin to sail both northward and southward from that area. So you have merchants sailing south along the coast. Remember, at this point, they do not have the capacity to directly cross the oceans. So they're mostly coastal, and they hug the coast down towards the Tamil coast, and eventually turn up in the coastline of Sri Lanka, and you begin to see settlements of Odia Bengali merchants begin to settle there, and in some ways this is remembered somewhat mythologically in the foundation myths of the Sinhalese people, where they talk about a king called a prince called Prince Vijaya, who was thrown out from by his father from the kingdom of Vanga or Banga, and sailed down with some of his followers to Sri Lanka, and then became the forefather of the Sinhalese people. So this legend perhaps remembers these Odia Bengali merchants and settlers who had probably come here in ancient times. Now, some of these merchants from this Odia Bengal area also begin to sail westward and eastward, and they go hugging the coast along the Irrawaddy Delta out towards the Isthmus of Kra, which is the bit of Thailand from which Malaysia hangs off. And then they crossed the isthmus onto the other side, onto the Thailand side, and then would sail along towards Mekong, towards what is now Vietnam and Cambodia and so on. And we begin to see kingdoms popping up even in that area who are clearly influenced by Indian culture, certainly by the 4th century BC. Now, who were these people who were doing these voyages? Clearly they were sailing, these were Indian explorers sailing into the unknown, because many of these places were totally unknown to people. We do not know their names, unfortunately, Indian records who they are, but interestingly, there are legends in Southeast Asia about who these people were. And while it's impossible to say whether the specific instances are real, But there are some interesting legends, and there is one particularly interesting legend about a Brahmin called Kaundinya, who captained a ship, an Indian merchant ship, sailing along the Mekong Delta in what is now southern Vietnam. And he was sailing along when he was attacked by pirates. And Kaundinya, being a brave lad, he rallied his troops and they fought off the pirates. Unfortunately, what happens is that they have serious problems with their ship, because it develops leaks, and they have to beach it in order to repair it. Now, when they are repairing their ship, unfortunately, a local tribe, a Naga tribe or serpent tribe, suddenly turns up and surrounds them. Now, it's a hopeless situation, but nevertheless, Kaundinya again rallies his crew and they are preparing to defend themselves. But it looks quite hopeless because, they are just a small crew and there is this big tribe surrounding them. But as luck would have it, this tribe is led by a warrior princess called Soma, who sees Kaundinya and falls in love. And she then proposes marriage. Now, Kaundinya probably did not have too much of a choice in the matter, but nevertheless, he accepts the proposal and they get married. So this marriage of Kaundinya and Soma leads to what appears to have been a fairly prosperous kingdom, because for the next 1,500 years, or even today, all the royal families of this part of the world would hark back to this story of the marriage of Soma and Kaundinya and try to draw a lineage from it. So it's quite interesting that when the great empires of Angkor and Champa, etc., in later times would emerge, their royal families would try and trace back their lineage. Very often the female lineage back to this particular event. Now, over time, what happens is that Indian sailors and others as well begin to discover that you can use the monsoonic winds to, instead of hugging the coast, you can directly cross the seas. And you begin to see a boom of trade, both coasts. So on the western coast, you begin to see trade first with the Arabs and Egyptians, but then further on, supply chains going on to the Greeks and through the Mediterranean all the way through to the Romans and so on. And so by the height of the Roman Empire in the first, second centuries AD, you begin to see a lot of trade on the west coast of India, particularly with Kerala, Karnataka, Maharashtra, even with Gujarat. Lots of trade going back and forth, and there are literally hundreds of ships sailing between the Indian coast and the Roman Empire. So much so that there is, Indian cloth, Indian spices. Some of those spices, by the way, were not Indian, but had been picked up by the Indians in Indonesia, were being traded on to the Europeans. And Indian metallurgical products become quite commonplace in many parts of Europe. And so you find pepper, which is an Indian product, being found in in excavation sites, Roman excavation sites in Britain, for example. So there was a lot of trade happening to the west. Major port that was a hub of this was Muchiripatnam or Muziris, which is just north of present-day Kochi. And on the east coast, you similarly see a huge amount of trade happening. By this time, you begin to see these merchants from all along the eastern seaboard sailing down towards Sri Lanka and then swinging across using the currents to go across to Sumatra. And from there, some of them would sail through the Malacca Straits out towards China and Korea and so on. And some of them would sail further south through along the west coast of Sumatra through the Sunda Straits out to Java and Bali and so on. So you have a lot of trade going back and forth between India and China. In fact, many Indian princesses seem to have intermarried with Southeast Asian princes and princesses, and one of those were the Pallavas, who seem to have intermarried quite a lot with Southeast Asians. in fact, one of their greatest kings, Nandivarman II, was possibly born in Cambodia or Malaysia and was brought in as a 10-year-old when the Pallava throne fell vacant. So there was a lot of trade going and forth, but also cultural influences. It's not by chance that the largest Hindu temple in the world is not in India, but in Cambodia, Angkor Wat. Again, this world, what is interesting to note is that by this time, this is not just about heroic individual merchants sailing off into the blue, but had become a very large-scale trade. And this meant that we were dealing really with organized, large-scale, almost corporatized entities. So, for example, while there may have been individual merchants going back and forth, a lot of the trade was done by certainly the early medieval period by corporatized guilds, almost like multinational companies. These were large corporatized guilds involving hundreds of shareholders. They had their own armies. They were trading, large trading ships going back and forth, and many of them survived empires. So kings came and went, but these corporatized guilds would continue for hundreds of years. And they were backed, interestingly, by temple banks. Now, when we think of medieval temples, we very often think of them having a lot of gold, and people get the impression that that's because the kings were handing over all their wealth to the temples. Now, while the kings, of course, spent a lot of money making some of the very largest temples, even in that time, I can assure you, it was difficult to get Indian politicians to part with a large amount of money. So the reason the temples were very rich is because they used to function as banks. And many of these corporatized guilds were basically, the trade they were doing was backed by these temple banks. That's how they made their money, from venture capital. And we have copper plate contracts, even extant that have survived till today, of contracts between temples and merchant guilds, between merchant guilds and artisan guilds, between temples and infrastructure projects of various kinds like toll roads and all kinds of things. So the temples were very important, not just culturally but economically, as a financial backing of this entire enterprise. And certainly by the 10th, 11th century AD, it was a huge amount of trade going back and forth. If you went to, say, the beginning of the 11th century, when the Cholas were at their height, global economic activity, the central axis of it, was trade between the Fatimid Empire of Egypt, who controlled the eastern Mediterranean, Cholas in southern India, and the Song dynasty in China. And this was trade going back and forth, with the Indians obviously benefiting a lot because they were right in the middle of it. This also, of course, led to a lot of interesting geopolitics. You had, as I mentioned earlier, two important routes to China from India. One was through the Malacca Straits, which was between the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra, and the other was between Sumatra and Java, which is the Sunda Straits. Now, typically, the Sumatrans, i.e. the Srivijaya Empire, controlled the Malacca Straits, and the Javanese kingdoms like Shailendras, later on the Majapahit, would control the Sunda Straits. Now, what happened is, in the very beginning of the 11th century, the Javanese became very powerful, and they began to push out the Sumatrans, the Srivijaya kingdom of Sumatra. So the Sumatrans went to the Chinese for help, and the Song dynasty provided backing to them. And using that backing, the Srivijaya pushed the Javanese back to Java, and for the first time they ended up controlling both the Sunda Straits and the Malacca Straits. And they began to then use their control over this to extract a large amount of tolls and taxes. Now, this was a real problem, and it seems to have annoyed the Cholas no end, because they then in 1017 sent a naval expedition out to kind of warn the Sumatrans that they were unhappy. But it didn't quite work because the Sumatrans were clearly enjoying their power. It also seems that about this time, the Cambodians were reaching out to the Rajendra Chola, who was the reigning king, and they had some sort of a treaty going. Whatever it was, by 1025, things came to a head. And Rajendra Chola then assembled a very large fleet in Nagapatnam, which was the main port, and they sailed across to the Sunda Strait area. And from there, they made their way onto the other side up the Malacca Straits, sacking all the Srivijaya ports along the way. And then finally defeating the main Srivijaya army in Kadaram, or what is now Kedah. And then it came back. Now, this particular raid is, of course, well known. Many of you will have heard of it. But this did have a major impact on the geopolitics of the time. It seems to have cooled off the Srivijayas. You begin to see the Srivijayas now going on joint embassies to the Chinese. Now, what is interesting here is the geopolitics of it, in that the Chinese, who had been the original supporters of the Srivijaya, did not do anything when the Cholas turned up and beat them up. I do not know exactly why. It's not very clear, at least from what I have been able to put together. But it is quite possible that the Song dynasty or the Song emperor was themselves not happy with the rent extraction by the Srivijaya. Whatever the reason is, they did not support their vassal when the Indians turned up and gave them a real beating. Nevertheless, that once the trade routes were cleared up, trade resumed and would continue to resume till several decades later, towards the end of that century, the Chola Empire itself went into decline. Now, this world that I have described, however, went through a major shock in the beginning of the 13th century. It happened in slightly different ways in different places, but basically, the last decade of the 12th century, but more importantly, in the first 2-3 decades of the 13th century, there was a major shock to this trading world that I just described. In India, there was the Turkic invasion. You saw the Turks coming out of Central Asia and basically very brutally conquering India. But also the Mongols similarly, essentially destroyed the Song Empire in China. And of course, the Fatimids, and of course, there's the sacking of Baghdad by the Mongols, and the Mamluks similarly take over from the Fatimids in Egypt. So basically, this world that I just described was essentially wrecked by Central Asians, the Mongols in Middle East and China, and the Turks in India. And there is absolute, a massive shock, just like the shock that I described to you earlier, in the earlier period. There is a major shock. However, it is quite interesting how over the subsequent decades, different places reacted differently to this. Ultimately, under the Mongols, the Chinese would recover somewhat, but of course, under the Ming, they would really, throw out the Mongols and really come back as maritime power. In the Middle East, once the Mongols went into decline, there was a resurrection of many of the older empires. The Arabs came back and were back into trading, and the Middle East kind of came back. But the Indians went into some sort of a shell. And it's quite interesting that by the 13th century, the Indians, who had been for thousands of years at this point, a major maritime civilization, developed a sort of fear of the sea. They began to say crossing the seas was a bad idea, particularly for upper caste, which is all strange because, as I mentioned to you, much of the early exploration seems to have been done by Brahmins of anything. And whatever the reason may be, we developed this idea of Kala Pani, that crossing the seas is a bad idea. It's sort of a major civilizational loss of confidence. I don't know why this happened. Maybe there were epidemics which had happened and we sort of developed a fear of the outside. But certainly one part of it was the sacking of the temples. Now, typically we tend to think of this purely in cultural and religious terms, in terms of sacking of the temples being a major shock. But it is also a major shock from the financial and trading perspective, because the entire financial muscle and risk-taking ability of this culture had been wiped out by this. And certainly the case that some part of Indian sort of loss of economic confidence had to do with the sacking of the temples. Somnath, for example, of course, had been sacked a bit earlier, but Somnath was on the beach. If you go to visit Somnath, you'll see it was a major port, and Somnath temple is on the beach. It also functioned as a port. Many of the southern Indian temples had functioned along with a port and as banks. And so the destruction of the temple banks was clearly one part of the story of how we ended up developing a fear of the outside world. Now, this sort of disruption begins to, however, ease up, as I said, in other parts, particularly the revival of the Persians, the Safavids, and of course of the Arab traders and merchants in the West. And to the East, there is this major rise of Chinese mercantile activity. So you see suddenly under the early Ming, these huge voyages that are done to the Indian Ocean, led by, interestingly, a Muslim eunuch called Admiral Zheng He. Now, these were not trivial voyages. They were massive voyages involving 25,000 sailors, huge number of ships, and they made their way in the early 15th century. So between 1400 and 1433, they made a series of these grand voyages into the Indian Ocean, and they they were powerful enough that they could land in places like Sri Lanka and interfere in local politics, try to change their king and so on. They made their way all to the east coast of Africa. They played politics in Southeast Asia and so on. Now, what is important here to note is that it is not, as some Europeans, his scholars tend to project this as grand voyages of discovery. Far from it. The Chinese were sailing in areas that were very well known to them for hundreds of years before that, because of the trade I have already described in the previous, just earlier. So in the previous centuries, these routes were already well known. The Indians and Arabs, of course, knew about it, but even Chinese ships used to sail these seas. So they were basically sailing along routes that were well known. What was new was the sheer scale of what they were doing, and the geopolitical ability to project power far, far away from the Chinese homeland. So this was a very major event. It is also interesting how they also interfered with the geopolitics of that time. As I already mentioned, the Indians were no longer major maritime powers by this point, but the Arabs certainly would have noticed these grand voyages. But the real contest in the Indian Ocean with, the only rivals, so to speak, in the Indian Ocean were not the Indians or the Arabs, but the Indonesians, which were themselves at that time at the height of their Majapahit empire. And the Chinese clearly saw them as a threat, because they set up the kingdom of Malacca as a counterweight to the Majapahits of Java. And in fact, they encouraged the Malaccans to convert to Islam. And over time, Malacca would become powerful, and this gradual Islamization of Southeast Asia in some ways certainly was part of a Chinese geopolitical move of the mid 15th century. Now, if you had come to the Indian Ocean world and were, or even looking at the world economy in the mid 15th century, you would have thought that the next few hundred years would be of Chinese dominance, because they were clearly technologically much more advanced, they were rich, and they were basically no contest. Even though and of course in India the Mughals had not yet arrived, so there was, it had divided up. The Vijayanagar Empire did exist in southern India, but it was, despite being very much driven by trade and mercantile trade, Vijayanagar Empire never quite developed large navies. So for some reason, perhaps this already well ingrained fear of crossing the seas, I'm not sure. But the fact is, the Vijayanagar Empire was not a naval empire in that sense. This is this is the environment, however, where something very interesting happens, and this again relates to the twists and turns of history. Remember the Chinese eunuch Zhang He that I mentioned, who was in charge of the great Chinese navy? Well, it turns out that the Chinese emperor died, and a new emperor came to the throne, and the new emperor was supported by the Confucian mandarins, the bureaucrats, and they were suspicious of the eunuchs, who were their rivals. So what they did is, they did what all good bureaucrats do: they switched off money to the eunuchs and their chief source of power, which was the navy. So suddenly the navy did not have funding, and the Chinese navy went into decline, not because it was defeated at war, but because the bureaucrats basically switched off the money, and the great ships of the Chinese actually ultimately rotted in the port, and basically the entire navy was eventually disbanded as a political move, internal political move. And so you had, by the second half of the 15th century, a huge vacuum in the Indian Ocean. The Chinese had come, they had beaten up everybody around, they had, geopolitically tied up the Majapahit and forced them into decline. But they themselves, because of their own internal politics, had withdrawn from the Indian Ocean. And in this space, you suddenly had a new power turning up, which was the ships of the Portuguese, captained by Vasco da Gama. So when the Europeans turned up in the Indian Ocean, they were basically handed the Indian Ocean on a platter, because the Chinese had been there and cleaned it up for them and then withdrawn. So this is the context in which the European colonization of the Indian Ocean world started. It was a vacuum created first by Chinese expansionism and then a sudden Chinese withdrawal. Now, I have spoken for a long time. Just to give you a sense of the history, I can keep going further to more recent times, but I think there are a few lessons that I would like to draw from this for present times. The first and most important lesson of history is that it is extremely non-linear. And I say this because most economists, unfortunately, tend to think of the world in terms of linear regressions. This is sad, because in fact the world we live in is one of structural breaks, of sudden and unexpected twists and turns. Anybody who is living through the current period will appreciate what I'm saying. Many times in our history has been taken over by, drought or sudden geopolitical events, or foreign invasion, or something of that kind, that has completely thrown us off into a different direction from what people would have thought. So the most important thing to learn about India, its place in the global economy, or thinking about the world in general, is that it is a very uncertain place, and it goes and it's all about uncertainty and random twists and turns, and the ability to survive those twists and turns that matters, not our ability to predict exactly how things are going. The second important thing which draws from this is that the ability, the success of a civilization, a country, or even perhaps an individual, depends on the ability to deal with this uncertain world, and particularly the ability to take huge risks and survive those risks. Um, so, um, the Indian decline after the Turkic conquest is quite interesting because one, we somehow seem to have lost that sort of that condigner spirit of having gone out somewhere out there in Vietnam on a small leaky ship and exploring the place, marrying a local lass and setting up a kingdom. That was a certain kind of attitude, which is quite interesting, which pops up later with the Europeans. It is the same attitude that, say, Columbus had when he sailed westward. He changed the world, he made massive new discoveries, but frankly, he was wrong about everything. He was wrong about the circumference of the earth. Even after discovering the Americas, he did not realize he had discovered a completely new continent, and he kept harping on it being India. So, knowledge may be power, but what really drives it all ultimately is the ability to take risk. So, a risk taking culture is important. And as we come out of this crisis ourselves today, it is important that we do not lose our risk taking ability. In fact, what will be interesting about the world that we are entering is not who was damaged most by it in the short run, but who come out of it taking the lesson, not that we now need to build and protect ourselves, but are much more willing to go out there and try to take advantage of whatever it is the new world that will emerge. And believe you me, we are going to enter into a very new world after this coronavirus shock. It has been a huge shock, not in health terms, in economic terms, in geopolitical terms. This new world will have different equations. We have to be willing to engage with that world. We cannot go back into a shell like we did after the Turkic invasions. The third important thing is the importance of financial systems, which relates to the first 2 points, because financial capacity to take risks is important, because ultimately finance is what drives risk taking. This is why, as we go through this, it is absolutely critical that we preserve the risk taking ability of our financial system through this crisis. Whatever needs to be done to keep our financial system protected, liquid, and importantly, able to take risks on the other side of this cycle is critical. We cannot allow the paralysis that happened after the 13th century destruction of our temple banks. We cannot go back into a shell. I'm repeating this over and over again because I want to make it clear that the ability to go out there and take advantage of this new world matters a great deal. 4, and again related to the last several points, do not predict forward using the logic of the past. As I said, if you were in the mid 1400s, you would have thought the world belonged to the Chinese. It turned out the next 5 centuries belonged to the Europeans, and that in fact got triggered by a tiny country on the Atlantic called Portugal, and then subsequently the Dutch, and then finally the British. They were somebody sitting in 1400s and had been told that these countries far out in the Atlantic were going to be the future in fact would be dominant powers for the next 500 years, they would have laughed at you. So keep a mind open about how exactly the world is going to evolve here. And as we as Indians if we are willing to go out there and engage with this new world rather than sort of go back in a shell as a result of whatever hits we take from this shock, then I'm sure we will be able to be a major player in whatever it is that this new world will throw at us. So I think I'm going to stop here and see if I can answer some questions. I can see some questions popping up on the left. Just a second, I'm just reading through some of the comments so that I have some sense of what they are. Um, well, what there's a lot of them, a lot of people asking me about what our immediate economic plans are. Sadly, I am not at in a position to talk about uh, uh, in a structured way about what may or may not be the government's response. Um, that is, any package that may come across from here on is the finance minister's prerogative. So as and when something is announced, as you may see, I come on to television and do talk about the implications of this, but it would not be correct for me to speak about specific packages, etc., in a lecture like this. All I will say is, um, the political leadership of this country does understand many of the things I just mentioned. We understand the gravity of many of the problems, both on the health side and on the economic side, and we will do what is necessary. However, we have, and I have mentioned this in television interviews as well, that we have decided to take a somewhat different approach from maybe other countries have. Many other countries may have come up and given a large economic package up front. We have instead opted to do it step by step. The first thing we needed to do was to respond to the health crisis, which is why we fairly early on in our cycle, we went in for a lockdown, much earlier than many countries did. In fact, in terms of our cycle, we were very, very early on. And I think we did the right thing. Human lives have to be the first priority. In any case, that nothing on the economic front will make any sense if this epidemic spreads far and wide in the country. So the priority was the health emergency. But once that was in place, we began to do other things that were necessary. But we did it step by step rather than do this one big package approach. We realized that was end of year, so there were a large number of deadlines for the financial deadlines that were there. We pushed that back to June 30th, bought ourselves some space. The Reserve Bank came across with a bunch of measures to keep liquidity going and provide some sort of a relief to the corporate sector. And then, of course, we announced a package of around about 1.7 lakh crores, which Finance Minister announced, which was basically to make sure that the bottom of our society, the poorest of the poor, have some money, some physical food, and other resources provided to them to keep going through this. It's not going to solve poverty, we know that, but it will at least keep people going through this. And of course, support for insurance and other things for our medical frontline workers. So these were things to simply keep the system going through a lockdown. We do not claim that this is going to solve all the economic problems we will face as a result of this shock, both in terms of the global shock that will have an impact on us and our own lockdown, which will undoubtedly have an impact on us. So, but our approach has been, and you can disagree, has been to do this step by step rather than in one big jump. Now, let me see, what are the other questions that you have? Somebody's asked me about my book on Indian revolutionaries. Sadly, I have done all the research. I just don't have time to write it. So it's all in my head. I just don't know when I'll be able to write it. And I was hoping I'll get some more time maybe this year, but looks like this is going to be a particularly difficult year. So I don't know. I really don't know when I'll be able to write it. But let me assure you, it's something that whenever I have time, I will begin to do that. Many people are asking what about the immediate post-COVID world. Well, one of the things that I tried to give a sense of from that was, look, India, China, and have been in geopolitical rivalry in the Indian Ocean world for a very, very long time. Sometimes we had the upper hand, sometimes they had the upper hand. This rivalry and in many cases cooperation will go on. We will cooperate and be rivals, I think, even into the future. Of course, a lot will depend on how the rest of the world now responds to this new world. But it is the case that I think we should be prepared for supply chains and geopolitical calculations to be quite different in this new world, and they do go together. So again, um, we should remain quite flexible about how it will be. But whatever it is, we can have to play this game on the front foot. We have to be out there, participate, whatever happens, in an active way, and remain a risk-taking people. We cannot go back into a shell. You know, the worst thing that we can do, from the worst learning that we can have from this particular shock, is that the world is an uncertain place, and it's better to kind of go back behind walls. The world does not wait for you. The Chinese themselves discovered this, by the way, when they withdrew from the Indian Ocean, and and then built a large wall around themselves, the Great Wall of China. That didn't protect themselves at all. Mongols and then later on the Manchurians simply went round the walls. And then, of course, even the Europeans turned up at their doorstep with their ships. So the one lesson we should learn from history is the world is indeed an uncertain place, but it belongs essentially to those who are willing to sail into the unknown. So we have to retain that spirit of risk taking, no matter how difficult and uncertain the world may look. So some people have talked about technology, the only answer to the world. This is Mahesh Dabak. Well, one of the answers is, well, the world is a complicated place, and history is mixed up with all kinds of different ingredients coming together. Technology in itself means nothing. In fact, again, history is a very good example of this. When Vasco da Gama turned up in the Indian Ocean, the ships he turned up in were actually much more backward than the ships the Chinese had 75 years earlier. Admiral Zheng He's ships in 1430 were much, much bigger, in fact, 4 to 5 times larger. They were much more advanced in terms of design, but the technology didn't save them because their own politics, their own mindset changed. So the Europeans were risk takers. The Chinese decided to withdraw behind their wall. And so technology in itself is only a tool. And I don't think simply thinking of the world in a single, using a single way of thinking is a particularly good way of thinking. It's about the mix and match of different things: geopolitics, technology, economic policies, financial policies, and a culture of risk taking. I keep coming back to that as being an important thing. Somebody has written me, what is India's current view of reinvigorating historical maritime trade routes? China has been making progress on this. I think you are relating it more to OBOR. Sure, the Chinese did put in a huge amount of effort into it, no doubt. And they did create a sort of Silk Route 2.0 through this OBOR. Now, they did throw a lot of resources into it. We don't have those kinds of resources. We have taken a much softer approach. But that does not mean that we do not, that our approach is necessarily worse. As China is just about to discover, as we go through this major shock, many of those to whom they gave large amount of loans and so on will now not be able to repay them. And so they will have to think about how they are going to deal with a large number of debtors who have built infrastructure based on their money, but are now have great difficulty in repaying it. So, this is not a costless strategy that they took. We took a softer strategy. Some of it may be because that was the only thing we could do. We didn't have that kind of resources. Nevertheless, we have begun in recent times to take the Indian Ocean much more seriously. This is important. Till very recently, we thought of our neighbors merely in continental terms. So if you ask anybody who is Indian neighbor, we would always say Pakistan or China and so on. But if you think of the world in maritime terms, in fact, that is how we should, if in historically thought about the world, then our neighbors are Indonesia, Singapore, um, Mauritius, Oman, and maybe even Australia. After all, Western Australia is an Indian Ocean country. So there is a very different way of thinking about the world when you think about the world in terms of our own historical maritime worldview. So these many people may think that these things have no real impact, but in fact they have enormous present day impact. Even take Indonesia, for example. When it became independent in 1949, it named itself Indonesia. It's named after India because of all the huge amount of cultural influence they've had. Their national symbol is Garuda. Their currency is the rupiah. All of these are clearly derived from Indian sources, and they are very proud of it. But because we ourselves did not quite appreciate this because of our own mental imagery and framework, we have historically till very recently not taken any great advantage of this. I'm glad that in very recent years we have begun to create institutions like IORA and so on, and begun to take our sort of what should I say, space of influence, sphere of influence in the Indian Ocean much more seriously. After all, there is only one ocean in the world that is named after a country, and it's the Indian Ocean. But we never took it seriously till now. Here is another question, Aditya Joshi. How about buying, about what the impact of crude prices and hedging? Well, it's true that oil prices are low. It's good for a country, importing country like ours. And although it is low, you're right that oil is an item that does spike around quite a lot. So, there are ways of taking advantage of it. Hedging, of course, for a country is very difficult because of the scales required. The market is not liquid. But there are other ways of taking advantage of it. And indeed, they are being explored, and some of it is being acted upon. I'm not in a position to talk about the details again. But we are aware of the opportunities provided by cheap oil. And of course, it gives us a little bit of cushion at a difficult time to be able to buy cheap oil. It keeps our inflation low and provides at least one area where we can, absorb some taxes. So all of that is certainly being taken advantage of. Now, what other questions? I've got to stop now. But I think I'll just take one more question and then I'll stop. How much does our country inculcate risk-taking in our country? Well, of course, the government can do things, but first and foremost, remember, risk-taking is ultimately a cultural thing. We as a people need to be risk-takers. The government will only reflect the culture that we have. Europeans at one point in their history were great risk takers. They explored the world, they invented a large number of things. They were quite different, in fact, than the somewhat bureaucratic European Union that we today think of. Similarly, the Americans today are, at least over the last century and a half or so, have been great risk takers. And in fact, their risk taking has happened in different fields. And let me say, risk taking is not just a commercial or physical activity. Risk taking happens in multiple ways and tends to manifest itself at the same time in different ways. So very often the same culture generates risk taking at the same time in different places. So Venice, for example, in the 13th, 14th century was the center of risk taking in Europe. The Renaissance started there. And today we think of it as a place which did a great deal of cultural risk taking. But in fact, this was the place that did invented double entry accounting. It was Venice was a maritime power. It was a port, so it was also a hub of maritime activity. So the same place was doing both cultural, economic, maritime, all kinds of risk taking, all bundled together. 19th century Britain was a global superpower, but it was also a technological superpower. It was also a cultural superpower at about the same time. This is true of today's America. It is the single largest economy, but it's also culturally a hegemon. I mean, we are all influenced. I'm doing this on an Apple MacBook, on Facebook Live. All of this is American products, American ideas, speaking in a language which is now more American than British. So what I'm trying to say here is, when we are talking about risk taking as a culture, I'm not merely talking about commercial risk taking. A commercial risk taking will only be done by a culture that is risk taking in every facet of life, both in arts, in sciences, and sort of a culture which is continuously thinking new ideas and trying them out, and is not afraid of failing. Now, the government also has a role to play in this, and here I think creating taxation systems, financial systems that encourage risk-taking behavior, do not penalize failure. That is absolutely a critical part of the way we do our policy. So this is something that is very important. We think about it a lot, but ultimately this should be, for it to be a part of policy and everyday life, it has to be about a culture of risk-taking, because a renaissance, a rebirth, is ultimately driven by risk-taking at every level. Now I'm going to stop there because I think I've spoken on for quite a long time, certainly for about almost an hour. So I think I'll stop there. Hope you all enjoyed it. Goodbye. Thank you.